ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, and fellow citizens of the world, let me begin by saying this history is knocking at our door, and the choices we make in the coming weeks will echo for generations. We are standing at a crossroads where reason, diplomacy, and respect for law are being tested against arrogance, violence, and disregard for humanity. The question before us is not only about Israel and its actions, not only about Qatar and the risks of escalation, but about whether the international system we have built since the Second World War can still protect us from sliding into chaos. If we fail to answer this challenge, then lawlessness becomes the new normal, and every nation, every people will live under permanent threat. The recent strike targeting Qatar's capital represents not only an escalation in an already volatile region, but also a dangerous precedent that should alarm the entire world. Let us be clear, Qatar is not a battlefield. It is a sovereign nation, a hub of diplomacy, energy, and commerce, and an essential player in the international community. An attack on its capital is not just an act of aggression, it is an assault on the very principles of sovereignty and stability. This reckless act signals that the region is sliding away from negotiation tables and into the abyss of tit for tat violence, dragging countless innocent lives into its storm. The escalation of conflict in the Middle East, marked most recently by the strike on Qatar's capital, has placed the entire region on the edge of a precipice. This is not merely another episode in a cycle of violence that has haunted the region for decades. It is a deeply alarming shift with far-reaching consequences that extend far beyond the Gulf. When a capital city, home to embassies, international organizations, global businesses, and millions of civilians, is targeted, it signals that the norms of restraint which have held fragile peace together are being abandoned. The strike on Doha was not just a military act, it was a message, a provocation, and a stark warning that the conflict is now moving into dangerous new territory. The region stands at a point where stability, painstakingly maintained through diplomacy and economic cooperation, can unravel in a matter of hours. Consider what this escalation means for ordinary people. Families in Qatar, a nation long known as a mediator and diplomatic hub, now live under the shadow of fear. The idea that no city, no matter how globally connected or politically neutral, is safe from attack is profoundly destabilizing. It disrupts not only the physical safety of citizens, but also the very fabric of trust that societies need to function. If Doha can be targeted, then what does that mean for other capitals across the Middle East? Uh, what does it mean for the businesses, universities, and international organizations that have chosen Qatar as a base for dialogue and cooperation? The chilling reality is that escalation transforms civilian spaces into potential battlegrounds, erasing the distinction between war zones and cities once considered safe. This act also poses a direct threat to regional stability because Qatar is not an isolated player. It is an energy powerhouse, a diplomatic broker, and a vital link in the chain of global commerce. Any disruption to Qatar's stability is felt not only in the Middle East, but across Europe, Asia, and beyond, through rising energy prices, disrupted supply chains, and weakened platforms for negotiation. By striking at the heart of Doha, those who chose violence are effectively saying that the interconnected global economy and the diplomatic efforts of countless nations are expendable. Such reckless behavior cannot be dismissed as a local matter. It reverberates in boardrooms, parliaments, and households worldwide. The escalation also feeds into a wider regional dynamic that is already volatile. Tensions between Israel and its neighbors, the ongoing instability in Gaza, the fragile situation in Lebanon, and the deepening polarization across the Arab world all converge to create a tinderbox. The strike on Qatar is not an isolated spark. It is part of a broader firestorm of aggression, provocation, and lawlessness. When one nation crosses the line of striking a capital, others may feel emboldened to do the same. Retaliation becomes not only likely, but almost inevitable. And with every retaliatory act, the chances of diplomacy shrink while the risk of uncontrollable conflict grows. What makes this escalation particularly perilous is the absence of effective global intervention. Where is the international community when such acts occur? Where are the mechanisms that were supposed to prevent capital cities from becoming legitimate targets? The failure to respond decisively invites more of the same, encouraging further violations and making restraint seem like weakness. This is why the strike on Qatar cannot be viewed simply as another headline in the endless news cycle. It must be recognized as a pivotal moment, a test of whether the world will allow aggression to set the rules or whether it will reaffirm its commitment to peace and law. We must also recognize the psychological impact of such escalation. Striking a capital city is not only about military objectives, it is about instilling fear, about demonstrating that no one is beyond reach. It is a strategy designed to undermine confidence in governments, to make citizens feel vulnerable, and to pressure leaders into rash decisions. This, this is where escalation becomes most dangerous, for when fear dictates policy, diplomacy is abandoned, and war becomes inevitable. Qatar, like many nations, has invested in diplomacy as a shield against conflict. Yet this strike is a brutal reminder that diplomacy alone cannot survive without the backing of enforceable international law. The hook that must capture the world's attention is simple yet stark. If this can happen in Doha, it can happen anywhere. If the international community tolerates the targeting of one capital, then the precedent is set for others. What city will be next? Riyadh, Ankara, Tehran? Even beyond the Middle East, the normalization of striking civilian and diplomatic centers threatens to rewrite the rules of engagement in ways that leave no nation immune. This escalation is not just about Qatar, not just about the Middle East. It is about whether the global system is strong enough to protect us all from sliding into a future of permanent insecurity. The danger of escalation lies not only in the immediate violence, but in the chain reaction it sets in motion. Once lines are crossed, they are rarely redrawn. The strike on Qatar has moved the region into a darker, more unstable phase, and unless decisive action is taken, the spiral of conflict will only accelerate. The world must understand that escalation is not contained. It spreads, it infects, and it destroys the fragile webs of cooperation and trust upon which our collective safety depends. The violation of sovereignty and international law through the strike on Qatar's capital is not merely an isolated breach of conduct. It is a fundamental attack on the very principles that keep nations from sliding into endless cycles of violence. Sovereignty is the cornerstone of modern international relations. It is the idea that every state, large or small, powerful or modest, has the right to govern itself, to protect its people, and to conduct its affairs free from external aggression. When that principle is violated, it is not just the targeted state that suffers, the entire global order trembles. Qatar's capital was not struck in a vacuum. It was struck in defiance of the most basic norms that the international community has pledged to uphold. To target a capital city is to cross a threshold that civilized nations agreed long ago should remain protected. These are not military outposts or battlefield positions. Capitals represent the heart of governance, diplomacy, and the civic life of a people. An attack on such a place is an assault on diplomacy itself. Embassies sit there, international organizations reside there, and countless civilian lives depend on the sense of security that a capital is meant to provide. By shattering that security, the aggressor sends a dangerous message that no space is sacred, no institution is safe, and no agreement is binding. This erodes not only the sovereignty of Qatar, but undermines the global belief in boundaries that cannot be violated. The United Nations Charter is explicit in prohibiting the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Yet, what we see today is a flagrant disregard for this foundational principle. The rules were not designed as mere ideals to be admired. They were crafted out of the bloodshed of the 20th century when lawlessness and aggression plunged the world into devastating wars. To dismiss them now is to repeat history's darkest mistakes. When a strike on Qatar is allowed without accountability, the charter becomes paper thin, its promises hollow, and its deterrent effect non-existent. What then prevents any other state from pursuing similar acts of aggression against its neighbors? The violation of sovereignty has consequences that ripple far beyond Qatar's borders. Every nation, whether in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, or Asia, relies on the principle of sovereignty as its ultimate protection. Small states, in particular, depend on international law to shield them from the overreach of larger powers. If the international system fails to defend Qatar's sovereignty, what confidence can smaller nations have that they too will be protected when targeted? The normalization of such attacks creates a world where power dictates rights, where legality is irrelevant, and where smaller states become permanent pawns in the games of stronger powers. What makes this violation especially alarming is its brazenness. This was not an ambiguous border clash or an accidental incursion. It was a direct strike on a nation's capital. The symbolism of this act cannot be overstated. It is designed to show contempt for the rules that bind nations together, a to flaunt power in the face of law and to intimidate not only Qatar, but all who might resist. This is why the world cannot afford to treat the incident as just another conflict in a troubled region. It is not a local matter. It is a precedent-setting act with global implications. The hook that should shake every policymaker awake is if sovereignty can be violated so easily in Qatar, then sovereignty can be violated anywhere. Today it is Doha under threat, but tomorrow it could be Brussels, Tokyo, or Nairobi. Once the precedent is set that international law is optional, then no capital, no government, no people can ever feel truly secure again. It is not the size of the state that matters, but the principle of protection that is now at risk. The disregard for sovereignty is also an attack on diplomacy. For how can nations negotiate peace when their very capitals are treated as legitimate targets? Diplomacy thrives on the assumption that states are secure enough to sit at the table, to compromise, to engage in dialogue. Strip away that security, and diplomacy collapses under the weight of fear and mistrust. By striking at Qatar's sovereignty, the aggressor has struck at the very heart of peaceful resolution. The world must confront the uncomfortable truth. Law without enforcement is not law at all. It is suggestion. If the international community does not act decisively to reaffirm the inviolability of sovereignty, then the system will continue to erode. And once the system crumbles, rebuilding it will be infinitely harder. The strike on Qatar was more than an act of aggression. It was a test of whether the world still values the rules it claims to defend. The test is ongoing, and failure will not only cost Qatar its peace, but will cost humanity its fragile shield against lawlessness. Israel's growing disregard for international law and its unchecked military actions represent one of the most serious threats, not only to the Middle East, but to the credibility of the global order itself. What we are witnessing is a state operating as if it is beyond accountability, dismissing the very institutions designed to prevent war and protect civilians. This lawlessness has ceased to be a regional concern and has become a global one because the principle at stake is universal. If one state can openly defy the law with impunity, then what prevents others from doing the same? The unraveling of legal norms anywhere is a danger everywhere. The pattern is by now undeniable. Israel has carried out actions that openly contravene international conventions, targeting civilian areas, violating the sovereignty of neighboring states, ignoring repeated United Nations resolutions demanding compliance with humanitarian and legal standards. Each act chips away at the authority of global institutions, weakening their capacity to protect vulnerable populations elsewhere in the world. It is not simply a matter of Israeli-Palestinian politics. It is about the message being broadcast to every government across the globe that rules can be bent or broken without consequence if one possesses enough military strength or political backing. This is the heart of the danger, the normalization of lawlessness. When Israel dismisses international rulings, it does more than create immediate suffering on the ground. It corrodes the foundation upon which diplomacy and global trust are built. How can smaller nations place faith in the United Nations when they see that resolutions are flouted with no repercussions? How can global leaders speak of justice, equality, or human rights when they permit a state to repeatedly disregard those very values? This erosion of credibility does not stay confined to one region. It spreads across continents, fueling cynicism, feeding extremism, and undermining cooperation on the very issues: climate change, poverty, global security, that require collective action. The hook that the world must confront is this: when Israel is allowed to operate outside the boundaries of law, the international system itself is put on trial. Every act of defiance without accountability delivers a verdict of weakness, proving that our rules-based order is more fragile than we want to admit. If lawlessness prevails in one place, it creates a precedent that can and will be invoked elsewhere. Tomorrow, it may be another nation that decides international treaties are optional, that humanitarian law is negotiable, and that power alone defines what is permissible. The danger lies not only in Israel's actions, but in the silence that follows them. This lawlessness also carries enormous human consequences. The people most directly affected, families in Gaza, Lebanon, and neighboring regions, are left to pay the price of unchecked aggression. Schools, hospitals, and civilian homes become targets. The sense of insecurity becomes generational, fueling cycles of anger and despair that reverberate for decades. Such realities are not accidents of war. They are the predictable outcomes of a system in which one state refuses to be constrained by law. And yet, as these violations continue, the international response remains muted, as if the suffering of ordinary people can be overlooked when it complicates geopolitical calculations. There is also a profound moral cost to tolerating Israel's disregard for the rules. The global order rests not only on treaties and charters, but on an implicit understanding that power must be tempered by principle. Strip away that balance, and we are left with a world where the strong dominate the weak, where justice is an illusion, and where human rights are empty slogans. By failing to address Israel's lawlessness, the international community signals to the rest of the world that it lacks the will to defend its own ideals. And when ideals collapse, so too does the legitimacy of global leadership. The world must recognize that Israel's defiance is not happening in isolation. It is part of a broader trend in which states test the limits of the system, probing to see how much they can get away with. The failure to confront one violation emboldens others. The violation of sovereignty in Ukraine, the disregard for human rights in various authoritarian regimes, the use of force without authorization, all of these find oxygen in the precedent that Israel's lawlessness has helped establish. If the rules do not apply universally, then they apply to no one. The urgency is clear. If Israel's ongoing violations of law are left unchecked, the legitimacy of the international order will collapse under its own contradictions. The cost will not be borne by Israel alone. It will be borne by the entire global community as instability spreads, alliances fracture, and violence becomes the default language of international relations. The question The question the world must ask itself is stark. Are we prepared to live in a world where international law is nothing more than a suggestion? Because if the answer is no, then silence in the face of lawlessness is no longer an option. The danger that regional escalation in the Middle East could draw in global superpowers is not a distant possibility. It is a present and pressing reality. Every strike, every violation of sovereignty, every act of provocation takes place against a backdrop of international rivalries that stretch far beyond the borders of the region. The Middle East is not isolated. It is a global crossroads, home to critical energy resources, strategic waterways, and military bases that link East and West. It is precisely because of this interconnectedness that local conflicts never remain local for long. When missiles fall in Doha, when violence escalates in Gaza, or when tensions spike between Israel and its neighbors, the reverberations are felt in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and beyond. The region is a chessboard where the moves of one actor can compel responses from many others. And this is why escalation carries risks that could spiral far out of control. The reality is that the United States maintains deep military and political involvement in the Middle East. Its fleets patrol regional waters, its air bases are scattered across the Gulf, and its alliances with countries like Israel and Qatar are not easily disentangled. When an attack threatens these interests, the U.S. is compelled to act not only to defend its allies, but also to maintain credibility as a global power. Russia, on the other hand, has expanded its influence in Syria and has strategic partnerships with Iran, given it leverage in the region and making it a counterweight to U.S. presence. China, though more subtle, is no passive observer. It depends on Middle Eastern energy to fuel its economy and has invested heavily in infrastructure and trade through its Belt and Road Initiative. Europe, too, cannot remain detached as its energy security and migration policies are directly shaped by the region's stability. When these powers find themselves aligned against one another, even indirectly, the risk of confrontation rises exponentially. The hook that should keep the world awake at night is this: a single strike in the Middle East could set off a chain reaction that pulls in the world's most powerful militaries, creating a conflict of global proportions. Imagine a scenario where the United States escalates in defense of its allies, Russia counters to protect its strategic foothold, and China asserts itself to safeguard its economic interests. Such a clash would not remain confined to the region. It would reverberate across financial markets, disrupt global supply chains, and threaten the stability of international peace. In short, a regional escalation has the potential to become the spark that ignites a global firestorm. We have seen this pattern before. The First World War was not planned as a global conflict. It was triggered by a local assassination that set off a cascade of alliances and obligations. Within weeks, the entire world was engulfed. The Middle East today bears frightening similarities to that scenario: a web of alliances, competing interests, and simmering rivalries, all tightly wound together in a fragile balance. When one strand is pulled too far, the entire web risks collapsing. The strike on Qatar's capital is precisely the kind of act that can pull at that strand, forcing global powers into positions they may not have intended to take. It is also worth recognizing that great powers do not always respond rationally when their credibility is on the line. In international politics, perception often carries as much weight as reality. If a superpower is seen as failing to defend an ally or protect its interests, it risks weakening its global standing. Leaders, therefore, often escalate not because it is the best strategic choice, but because they fear the cost of inaction. This dynamic makes the risk of miscalculation extremely high. A strike intended as a warning can be misinterpreted as a declaration of war. A defensive response can be seen as aggression. Once such misperceptions take hold, the spiral toward broader conflict becomes difficult to contain. What is perhaps most alarming is the lack of effective communication channels between these global powers at a time when they are needed most. During the Cold War, even in moments of great hostility, the United States and the Soviet Union maintained hotlines to reduce the risk of accidental escalation. Today, such safeguards are weaker and mistrust between powers is deeper. With US-China relations strained, US-Russia relations fractured, and Europe caught between the potential for a regional escalation in the Middle East to become the trigger for a global confrontation is dangerously high. The world must recognize that the Middle East is not just another region of conflict. It is a global flashpoint where the interests of multiple superpowers collide. Escalation here is not simply about rockets and airstrikes. It is about the balance of global power, the credibility of alliances, and the stability of the international system. Every strike is a roll of the dice with stakes that extend to every corner of the planet. The sobering question is not whether escalation will affect the world, but how quickly it could spiral into a crisis that no nation can control. The need for accountability and diplomacy in this moment could not be more urgent. When a capital city is struck, when sovereignty is openly violated, and when the principles of international law are disregarded, silence or delay becomes complicity. The international community faces a stark choice: either enforce accountability for these actions or accept a world where violence is normalized, where grievances are settled through force, and where law is replaced by chaos. Accountability is not simply about punishing wrongdoing. It is about reaffirming the very standards that prevent the world from descending into a permanent state of conflict. Without it, every strike becomes a precedent, every violation a new normal, and every step toward diplomacy a gesture too weak to matter. Diplomacy, meanwhile, is the only tool capable of pulling the world back from the brink. Military responses may deter in the short term, but they do not resolve underlying tensions. They only deepen them. It is through dialogue, negotiation, and compromise that conflicts are truly resolved. Yet, diplomacy requires a foundation of trust, and trust is impossible without accountability. How can nations sit across from one another at the negotiating table when one side has repeatedly shown contempt for the law? How can agreements hold weight when there is no consequence for breaking them? This is why accountability and diplomacy are not separate paths, they are intertwined necessities. One provides the credibility for the other, and without both, peace is unattainable. The hook that must grip our attention is this: if we fail to demand accountability now, we are teaching the world that aggression works, that violence pays, and that law is a mere ornament in international relations. What incentive will any state have to pursue diplomacy when it can achieve its goals faster through brute force? What hope will civilians have for peace when leaders discover that escalation comes without cost? The absence of accountability is not neutrality, it is an open invitation for lawlessness to spread. It is also important to recognize that accountability is not just about punishing aggressors, it is about protecting the innocent, the civilians of Qatar, the families living under fear, and the countless others across the Middle East who suffer the ripple effects of instability deserve to know that the world stands with them. They deserve more than sympathy. They deserve action that ensures such violations are not repeated. Accountability restores faith in global institutions. It tells the vulnerable that their lives matter and that international law is not an abstract concept, but a shield meant to protect them. Without such assurance, people lose hope in diplomacy, and in its place grows resentment, despair, and radicalization. Diplomacy must be revitalized, and that requires more than formal summits and sterile communiques. It requires genuine political will, the courage to listen, and the recognition that no nation, however powerful, can achieve lasting security alone. The escalation we see in Qatar is a reminder that conflict spreads across borders, destabilizes markets, and fuels extremism that knows no nationality. Diplomacy is not charity. It is self-preservation for every state that wishes to live in a world of order rather than chaos. The challenge is that diplomacy today has been weakened by mistrust, by the repeated failures to enforce past agreements, and by the perception that negotiations are endless while violence produces immediate results. This is why accountability is the cornerstone. Without it, diplomacy is hollow. The global community has the mechanisms it needs: the United Nations, international courts, multilateral coalitions, and regional organizations. The problem is not the absence of tools, but the absence of political courage to use them. Too often, great powers allow their short-term interests to override their long-term commitment to order. Too often, alliances blind them to violations committed by their partners. The result is selective enforcement of the law, which weakens its authority for everyone. If we are serious about diplomacy, we must be serious about consistency, because diplomacy cannot function in a world where rules are applied only when convenient. We must also confront the danger of delay. History shows that when accountability is postponed, the cost of restoring order multiplies. Every year of inaction emboldens aggressors, deepens mistrust, and makes eventual peace more elusive. The Middle East has suffered decades of delayed diplomacy, where promises of future negotiations were used as excuses for inaction. The strike on Qatar is proof that the cost of waiting has grown too high. Accountability must be swift, diplomacy must be genuine, and the message must be unmistakable. The world will not reward lawlessness. The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. Without accountability, there is no trust. Without trust, there is no diplomacy. And without diplomacy, there is no peace. The strike on Qatar has reminded us of the stakes. The question is whether the world will respond with the urgency and resolve that this moment demands. The struggle unfolding before us is not only about borders, territories, or regional rivalries. It is about a deeper contest between law and lawlessness, between a world governed by principles and one dominated by raw power. The strike on Qatar's capital and Israel's defiance of international norms are not isolated acts of aggression. They are symptoms of a larger, more dangerous drift away from the rule of law. If the global community allows this trajectory to continue, we risk entering an era where justice is no longer the foundation of international relations, but an afterthought where the strong impose their will and the weak are left defenseless. This is the defining battle of our time, one that will determine whether the 21st century is shaped by cooperation and order or by chaos and unrestrained violence. The power of law lies in its universality. It provides protection not because of a state size or military strength, but because of its inherent principles of equality and justice. It is law that assures small nations that their sovereignty will be respected, and it is law that restrains powerful nations from turning their might into tyranny. Law levels the playing field. Yet today, what we see is the deliberate erosion of this universality. When Israel acts outside of international frameworks, when capitals are bombed with no accountability, and when great powers hesitate to enforce norms out of political convenience, the entire system begins to unravel. Law becomes selective, and selective law is no law at all. The hook that must strike at the conscience of the world is this: if lawlessness becomes the new standard, then no nation is safe, not the smallest, not the most powerful, not even those who believe they are shielded by alliances or geography. For in a world where power replaces principle, today's enforcer can become tomorrow's target, and today's victim can become tomorrow's aggressor. The cycle of lawlessness spares no one. History has already taught us this lesson in the devastation of the 20th century when unchecked aggression spiraled into global wars. Are we prepared to repeat that mistake in the 21st? This is not an abstract danger, but a very real one. Already, we see that when one state violates international law without consequence, others feel emboldened to do the same. The precedent set in one conflict becomes the justification for another. Aggression metastasizes, spreading across borders, undermining trust, and destabilizing entire regions. Once this culture of impunity takes root, reversing it becomes almost impossible. Leaders and regimes discover that violence yields results while law brings only delays. Citizens lose faith in global institutions and turn to radical alternatives, believing that justice cannot be found in established systems. The result is a world where violence becomes self perpetuating, where every grievance is settled with force, and where hope for peace fades into cynicism. The most profound danger of lawlessness is that it erodes the moral fabric of global leadership. Nations that once claimed to champion human rights and international norms are exposed as selective enforcers, applying standards only when it suits their interests. This hypocrisy not only undermines credibility, but accelerates the decline of the rules-based order. For if laws apply only sometimes, then why should they be respected at all? The perception of double standards feeds resentment, especially in regions like the Middle East, where people see the gap between lofty rhetoric and lived reality. This resentment fuels instability, making diplomacy harder and conflict more likely. It is vital to remember that law is not merely about punishment, but about prevention. Its purpose is to deter violations before they happen, to set boundaries that protect civilians and prevent escalation. But when those boundaries are ignored without consequence, law loses its deterrent power. The strike on Qatar, the ongoing defiance of Israel, and the muted response of the international community all serve as signals to others that the guardrails are down, that aggression will not be stopped, and that law has lost its bite. The longer this perception persists, the more difficult it becomes to restore order. We must recognize that the choice before us is not between war and peace or between diplomacy and force. It is between law and lawlessness. Without law, diplomacy collapses and peace becomes impossible. Without law, force becomes the default language of international relations. The battle we face today is about defending the principle that rules matter, that agreements are binding, and that humanity is capable of something better than endless cycles of violence. The stark reality is that the future of international relations hangs on how we respond to this moment. If law is upheld, there is hope that diplomacy can succeed, that conflicts can be managed, and that order can be preserved. But if law is abandoned, the descent into lawlessness will not stop at the Middle East. It will spread, destabilizing every region, every alliance, and every attempt at cooperation. The question is not whether law or lawlessness will prevail. It is whether the world has the courage to defend the principles it claims to value before it is too late.